They did not kill Jesus because he claimed to be the Son of God. That is what they taught you. That is what most people still believe today. But when you open the historical texts, when you look at who was in power in Jerusalem that week, when you understand what was at stake politically, you realize that the crucifixion was planned, calculated, executed by men who had much more to lose than faith. There were 3 men who could have saved Jesus, 3 men with real power in their hands, and each of them looked at the situation, weighed the cost, and chose their own neck. What I'm going to show you today is not an alternative version of the Bible. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is the real politics, the real interests, the real fears of 3 men who were at the epicenter of the most impactful event in human history. And when you finish this video, you will never be able to read this story the same way again. Think with me for a second. The year is 30 AD. Jerusalem is in flames. Not literally, but almost. The city is packed. These are the weeks of Passover, the most important festival on the Jewish calendar, and pilgrims from all over the ancient world are arriving in waves. The streets are full, the temple is full, and in the middle of all this, there is a man from Galilee who is causing a type of commotion that no one quite knows how to classify. He has no army, he has no money, he has no political office, but crowds follow him for miles. Sick people say they were healed by him. He speaks with an authority that leaves religious leaders uncomfortable. And when he enters Jerusalem mounted on a donkey, a symbol loaded with real meaning for any Jew who knew the scriptures, the crowd goes wild in a way that scares even the most experienced. And that is when everything begins to move. 3 men wake up that week and see in Jesus not a prophet, not a miracle worker, not a son of God, but a problem that needed to be solved quickly, silently, and preferably before the situation got completely out of control. These 3 men are Caiaphas, Herod Antipas, and Pontius Pilate. And the story I'm going to tell you about them is real. It is documented. It is in the Gospels, in the writings of the historian Flavius Josephus, in the Roman records. It is not invention, it is politics, the oldest and dirtiest politics in the world, where the power of a few decides the fate of one. Before talking about the 3 men, you need to understand the setting, because without understanding the setting, nothing that happened makes sense. Rome controlled everything. It is no exaggeration. The Roman Empire in the 1st century AD was the largest power structure the world had ever seen. It spread from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, from the coasts of Spain to the edges of Mesopotamia. Any place that mattered commercially, militarily, or strategically was under the eye of Rome, and Israel, small, mountainous, religious to the bone, was right in the middle of the way. The Roman occupation in Israel was not new, it was decades old, and the Jewish people hated every second of it. Not just for the obvious oppression, the crushing taxes, the soldiers in the streets, the laws imposed from outside, but because there was a much deeper wound, the humiliation of a people who believed they were chosen by God, now subjugated by pagans who worshipped statues. This combination, external oppression, an internal spiritual wound, and centuries of promises in the scriptures that one day a deliverer would come, created something extremely flammable. The Jewish people were waiting for a Messiah, an anointed one, someone who would come to restore the throne of David, expel Rome, and return Israel to its glory. And a Messiah, at that time, was not just a spiritual idea, it was a political and military idea. People expected a leader who would take up arms, a real king. So when Jesus appears, healing the sick, feeding crowds, speaking with an authority different from anything anyone had ever heard, and when people begin to call him the Son of David, the King of the Jews, the Messiah, this was not just religious excitement, it was the potential for revolution. And the people in power knew very well what revolution in Jerusalem meant. It meant Rome appearing with entire legions. It meant blood in the streets. It meant the end of everything they had built. so the clock began to tick. Let's start with Caiaphas, because he is the one who sets the machine in motion. Caiaphas was the high priest of Jerusalem, and before you imagine an old man praying in a quiet temple, let me tell you who Caiaphas really was. He was one of the most powerful and wealthiest men in the ancient Middle East. The office of high priest was not just spiritual, it was the highest position in Jewish society. It was political, it was financial, it was social. The high priest was the mediator between the Jewish people and Rome. It was he who guaranteed that taxes arrived, that rebellions did not explode, that the temple functioned as a point of social stability in an explosive region. And Caiaphas stayed in this position for almost 18 years. In the context of the time, this is extraordinary. Most high priests lasted 2-3 years before Rome swapped them for someone more convenient. Caiaphas lasted 18 because he was excellent at what Rome needed him to be, a loyal, pragmatic, and efficient administrator. He and his father-in-law Annas, who had been high priest before him and still controlled much power behind the scenes, had transformed the temple system into something we would today call a commercial monopoly. Pilgrims arriving for Passover needed to exchange their money for temple coins to pay religious fees. They needed to buy animals for sacrifice. And guess who controlled the money changers and the sellers inside the temple? The family of Annas and Caiaphas. It was a massive business, an operation of millions, and it was all inside the sacred space of the temple of God. So when Jesus enters the temple, looks around, takes a whip, turns over the tables of the money changers, releases the animals, and begins to shout that they made his father's house a den of thieves, this was not just a dramatic sermon, it was a direct economic attack. It was a public declaration in front of thousands of pilgrims that everything Caiaphas had built was corruption disguised as religion, and everyone saw it. Caiaphas heard of it in minutes, and the decision was made right there. Jesus needed to die. But it was not that simple, because killing someone the crowd was calling the Messiah during Passover, with the city packed, that could become the trigger for the rebellion that Caiaphas spent his whole life trying to avoid. So it needed to be done surgically, fast, at night, away from the eyes of the people. The Gospel of John records a meeting of the Sanhedrin, the council of Jewish leaders, where Caiaphas makes a statement that sounds religious but is completely strategic. He says, "You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." Notice the reasoning. He is not saying that Jesus is a sinner who deserves to die. He is making a cold political calculation, one life for the system, one death to save the power they all shared there. And that is what he put into practice. The arrest of Jesus happened at night, in a garden, away from the crowds. The trial in the Sanhedrin happened before dawn, in violation of the Jewish laws themselves, which prohibited nightly trials. The haste was intentional. Everything needed to be resolved before the people woke up and started asking questions. Caiaphas got what he wanted, but he knew he didn't have the power to execute anyone alone. He needed Rome. He needed Pilate. Before getting to Pilate, there is a character that most people forget in this story, Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was the son of Herod the Great, the same king who, according to the Gospel of Matthew, ordered the killing of all the babies in Bethlehem when Jesus was born. The father was brutal and paranoid. The son was different, not because he was better, but because his type of weakness was different. Herod had a history with religious figures who challenged him. A few years before Jesus, Herod had arrested John the Baptist. The reason was simple. John had publicly criticized Herod for marrying Herodias, the wife of his own brother. This was prohibited by Jewish law, and John didn't keep silent about it. Herod could have ordered John killed immediately, but the Gospel of Mark says something fascinating. Herod was afraid of John. He recognized that he was a righteous and holy man. He even liked to hear him speak, even without understanding much. But Herodias, the wife, wanted blood.
The death of John happened in the most absurd way possible. At a birthday party for Herod, Herodias' daughter danced in front of the guests and pleased them so much that Herod, in a mix of wounded pride and excess wine, promised to give her anything she asked for. The girl went to ask her mother what to ask. The mother said, "The head of John the Baptist on a platter," and Herod paid. Not because he wanted to, but because he had made the promise in front of everyone and couldn't go back without looking weak. This is Herod Antipas, in summary, a man who knew the difference between right and wrong, but chose his image every time.
When Jesus begins to become famous in Galilee, Herod becomes restless. The Gospel of Luke tells us that Herod told people he wanted to meet Jesus, but it also tells us that some Pharisees went to warn Jesus that Herod wanted to kill him. The two accounts together paint a perfect portrait of Herod, fascinated and threatened at the same time. During the trial of Jesus, Pilate discovers that he is a Galilean and therefore is technically under Herod's jurisdiction. In a clear political move, Pilate sends Jesus to Herod, who is in Jerusalem for Passover. It is a way for Pilate to say, "This problem is not mine." Herod is excited. He is finally going to see this man he has heard so much about. He wants to see a miracle. He asks question after question. Jesus answers nothing, not a word, zero. Herod becomes frustrated. He humiliates Jesus, puts an elegant robe on him as a joke, and sends him back to Pilate without making any decision. He does not condemn Jesus, but he does not defend him either. He chooses cowardly neutrality. And Luke records a disturbing detail. On that day, Herod and Pilate, who were enemies, became friends. Two men who avoided responsibility together, united by the silent complicity of those who saw injustice and chose to look the other way. We have arrived at the most complex man in this story, Pontius Pilate. Pilate was the Roman prefect of Judea. It was not the most glamorous post in the empire, but it was strategically important. Judea was a difficult region to govern, too religious, too proud, too explosive. And Pilate, in the 5 or 6 years he had been there, had collected a series of diplomatic disasters. He had brought Roman military standards into Jerusalem, standards that bore the image of Caesar, which the Jews considered idolatry. This caused protests so intense that an entire crowd lay down on the ground in front of him and said they would rather die than see that continue. Pilate backed down. He had diverted money from the temple treasury to build an aqueduct. It caused another riot. This time he sent soldiers in civilian clothes into the crowd with hidden clubs. Many died. He had massacred a group of Galileans who were performing sacrifices. The Gospel of Luke mentions this casually as something people commented on with Jesus. His record was that of a man who did not know how to read the people he governed, and Tiberius, the emperor in Rome, was clearly tired of receiving complaints about him. When the Jewish leaders arrive with Jesus on that Friday morning, the accusation they bring is very well chosen. It is not blasphemy. That would be a Jewish religious problem, and Pilate would not care. The accusation is political subversion. They say Jesus forbade paying taxes to Caesar. They say Jesus claimed to be king. To claim to be king was treason, and treason was something Pilate could not ignore. But Pilate talks with Jesus, and he becomes genuinely confused. This man does not have the profile of a revolutionary. He is not agitating armies. He has no plans for attack. He speaks about a kingdom that is not of this world. Pilate looks at him and sees no threat. So he goes outside and says to the crowd, "I find no fault in this man." The crowd presses harder, the priests press harder, and Pilate keeps trying to find a way out. The Passover tradition gave the governor the right to release a prisoner as a gesture of goodwill to the people. Pilate uses this as an escape. He offers a choice, Jesus or Barabbas.
Barabbas was not just any thief, he was a leader of an armed rebellion, a man who had fought against Rome. And the crowd, that same crowd that 5 days earlier had waved palms for Jesus at the city entrance, chooses Barabbas. Pilate tries a third way out. He orders Jesus to be flogged, perhaps thinking that the brutality of the punishment will satisfy those who asked for blood, without needing an execution. The soldiers place a crown of thorns on Jesus' head, a purple robe on his shoulders, and present him to the crowd. Pilate says, "Behold the man." It doesn't work. The crowd screams louder, "Crucify him." And then comes the final blow. The Jewish leaders shout a phrase that freezes Pilate in place. "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be king opposes Caesar." Friend of Caesar. In Latin, amicus Caesar. It was not just a compliment, it was a specific political title, a designation that indicated loyalty to the emperor. To lose this status meant losing protection in Rome. It meant that any enemy could go to Tiberius and say that the governor of Judea was protecting a man who proclaimed himself a rival king to Caesar. Pilate knew he had no way out. He asks for a basin of water. He washes his hands in front of everyone. He says that the blood of this man is not on him. It is the most famous staging in history. A man using a symbolic gesture to try to transfer a guilt that he knows is his. And then he signs the execution order. Here is a detail that most people overlook. The sign nailed above Jesus on the cross, the one that said, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." That was Pilate's idea. The chief priests went to him furious. They said, "Do not write King of the Jews, write He said he was King of the Jews." It's different. One is a statement, the other is just the claim of a madman. Pilate said, "What I have written, I have written." Why? Why, after everything, after trying so many times to escape, after washing his hands, after appearing so reluctant, does Pilate insist on this sign? Because that sign was not about Jesus, it was a message for everyone who passed by there, a declaration of Roman power. Look at what happens to anyone who challenges our authority. Look at what we do with kings we do not recognize. It's propaganda, it's intimidation, it's the Roman Empire using the death of a man as a political billboard. And furthermore, crucifixion itself was a political choice. Rome had several ways of executing people. Crucifixion was the slowest, the most painful, and the most public. It was reserved for enemies of the state, for rebellious slaves, for people whom Rome wanted to humiliate completely. It was designed to be seen from afar, to be suffered in public, to send a message that lasted for days while the person was still alive, suffering, on display. It wasn't punishment, it was performance. And the location was also chosen with care. Golgotha was outside the walls of Jerusalem, but near a busy road. Everyone who entered or left the city saw it. During Passover, with hundreds of thousands of pilgrims moving about, that was visible to an absurd amount of people. Rome knew exactly what it was doing. And now we arrive at the part that no political analysis can fully explain. 3 men with real power. 3 men who controlled armies, money, temples, laws. 3 men who on that Friday thought they were solving a problem. Caiaphas thought he was protecting the system. Herod thought he was keeping himself safe. Pilate thought he was saving his own career. And the man they killed had no army, he had no fortune, he had no office, he had fishermen and prostitutes as his closest friends. He was arrested at night like a criminal, tried in haste before dawn, tortured the next morning, and killed in the afternoon. End of story. Problem solved. System protected. Except not. Caiaphas lost everything 40 years later when Rome destroyed the exact temple he was trying to protect. In 70 AD, the legions of General Titus entered Jerusalem, tore down the temple stone by stone, the temple that Herod the Great had taken decades to build, and scattered ashes where there had been gold. Jesus himself predicted this, and it happened exactly as he said. Herod Antipas was eventually banished by Emperor Caligula, exiled to Gaul, which is today's France, where he died far from the power he loved so much, without ever gaining the title of king that he chased his entire life. Pilate was called back to Rome by the emperor, accused of excessive cruelty. The historian Eusebius writes that he ended up committing suicide. Other accounts differ, but the fact is that he disappeared from history in shame. And the man they crucified? 2,000 years later, he's the most discussed, studied, painted, sculpted, quoted, and adored human being who has ever walked the earth. There are over 2 billion people today who say he changed their lives. There are more ancient manuscripts documenting his existence than any other figure in antiquity. Every time you write the date, 2025, 2026, any year, you are using a calendar based on his birth. The 3 men who tried to erase this name from history ensured, without meaning to, that he would never be forgotten. The crucifixion of Jesus was not a religious accident. It was a calculated result of 3 systems of power feeling threatened by something they could not control. Caiaphas represented religion corrupted by money and politics. Herod represented